Basically, when we talk about justice, generally we talk about procedural justice and substantive justice. Laws are made, but many a times these laws are not exactly honored in their spirit. They are made in letter, but they are not honored in their spirit. I think same is the case with laws related to tribals or Panchayat Raj provisions related to tribals, because these provisions these provisions prima facie on the face of it are very good, progressive. At times, of course, it took some time for legal reforms, for legally recognizing tribal rights, legally recognizing the very existence of tribals. It took some time for Indian state to respond legally to tribal issues. But after so many years of independence and democratic government, we have reached a stage where several laws are in place, but then the issue is as to how they are implemented. It is, however, necessary for all of us to know as to what kind of laws are there, and if possible and wherever possible, if certain reforms are necessary in those laws, we need to ponder over that as well. Friends, Mithibai College and Tir Foundation has made an attempt, and in a way, it's a beginning, one can say, with this webinar series. We intend to even have some courses on issues faced by tribals, tribal economy, etc. And since we have some details of the participants, be we will certainly keep them posted about any such programs or courses that we would organize in future. I welcome today's speakers and thank you.
I'm briefly introducing our institute, TIR Foundation. TIR is an acronym for Tribal Ethos and Economics Research. We informally began our work last year in September with a small group of friends, well wishers, and recently got registered as a non-profit company. Our vision is to influence state and non-state policies to ensure tribal livelihood and natural resource security for the tribal people. So we conduct policy research and field research to proactively examine and expose the impact of laws and policies on tribal ethos regarding natural resources and their economics. It often happens that people at large think of tribals as a different planet or a disconnected world. People assume that we as citizens of India have nothing really to do with the tribes. हमें क्या फर्क पड़ता है? This question we asked too often regarding the issues of tribals in our country. So I would like to bring a few points to your notice. The stability and prosperity of tribal areas is crucial for both India's economy and ecology. Many major rivers are born in tribal areas. Many water bodies that cities survive on get their water from sources in tribal areas. These areas host the best forests, the global biodiversity hotspots. These areas contain mineral wealth, and almost all state borders are marked with such areas. The tribal population largely depends on primitive farming and gathering of forest produce for their livelihood. But it was unfortunately only 12 years ago that the parliament recognized their livelihood rights, their survival rights. But today's first speaker is going to talk about this in detail. But there has been an extreme backlog of development in terms of access to resources, in terms of connectivity, infrastructure, livelihood, and so many things. This is a result of colonial laws and bureaucratic stranglehold of resources, injustice perpetuated because of such systems. And people were forced to take up violent means and are lured by extremists. Such extremism cannot be eliminated by imposing brute state force. It needs better policies and administrative framework that can respond to people's aspirations. TIR exists to bring such policies. Currently, we are working with two state governments and central government's tribal ministry on policy research and advocacy.
It is a privilege for me to introduce Madam Shamona Khanna. Madam Khanna is a lawyer at the Supreme Court of India. She is a dedicated researcher in law-based issues. She has written numerous research papers and publications. I also take pleasure in particularly highlighting the fact that she has written on topics which are very closely associated with the discussion topics for the day as well. One of them is on historical wrongs and forest rights, which came to be published in July 2019. The other is titled Invisible Inequalities, an Analysis of the Safai Karmachari Andolan case, which was published in February 2019. Boundaries of Forest Land came to be published in June 2014. It was a chapter that presented an insider's view and a detailed critique of the judicial process behind the Godavarman case. It suggests that the Godavarman judgment has further centralized the forest management by empowering a special bench of the Supreme Court to decide upon matters of forest conservation and conversion and the forest bureaucracy. With this background, I invite Shamona ma'am to start her session. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much. At the outset, I want to thank the Mithibai College and also TIR Foundation for giving me this opportunity and this invitation to be able to speak with such a wonderful and wide range of participants and to interact with you. It is indeed a privilege, and I'm so happy to be here, even though I'm not there in person, but I'm just happy to be here virtually. So if I can just request Anuya, if you could start sharing the slide. I have made a PowerPoint presentation because I felt that, sometimes in a virtual setting, it's a little bit difficult to concentrate on what the speaker is saying. But we can, of course, interact more once the PowerPoint is over. Okay. You can go to the first slide. Thank you. The next one. So let me just begin immediately. Not this one, the previous one. Yeah, slide 2. Thank you. So I'll just begin immediately by putting before you a case that we handled a few years ago. This was about a village, Kalchini, in Ali Rajpur, Jalpaiguri, West Bengal. And it was a simple situation. The forest department officials had come to the village to carry out their, coop felling as they normally do to harvest the timber trees. They were stopped by the villagers and actively stopped. In fact, they took their machinery, etc., and stopped them physically from doing the work. As a result of which, the forest department officials went and registered a first information report against 16 villagers under various provisions of the Indian Penal Code, such as wrongful restraint, assault of a public servant, deterring him from discharge of his duty, etc., etc. And warrants of arrest were issued against the 16 villagers. Initially, they had gone underground, actually, because it is quite an alarming situation to have warrants. These are serious provisions of the IPC. Subsequently, the got together, and in fact, not just the 16 villagers who were the accused, almost the entire, very alarmed to find suddenly his courtroom crowded by lots of very angry villagers. And they said, we have come to surrender, but we refuse to acknowledge the fact that we have committed any crime. And they placed the Forest Rights Act before the court and explained to him that actually they are the owners or the right holders over the forest. They have every right to protect the forest from being cut down. And the forest department had no business coming there and cutting the trees without their permission. And in the result, the magistrate, after hearing arguments, was happy to release them on bail of 500 rupees each. And you can imagine how just setting the bail at rupees 500 each without any surety itself is an indication what the judge's view of the matter is. So this is a situation that has arisen in a framework of law and a tension between pre-existing law, existing structures of forest governance, and new structures of governance coming into force. And I want to now take you into the law and how this situation has come about and why situations like this are taking place across the country in tribal areas and forest areas. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea, I'm sure you have these data, but there are approximately 100 million people living on land which is classified as forest land in India. Out of the 587,000 odd villages in India, 170,000 villages with a population of 147 million are located either in or around these forests. And as per the estimates of the census 2011, 275 million to 400 million people are forest dependent in this country. And in fact, there continue to be forest villages, 4,500 and above forest villages inside forest areas which have not been classified as revenue villages till now, with a 13 lakh population of scheduled tribes. Now, in spite of the fact that there is such a large population of tribals and forest dwellers inside forest areas, there continues to be a perception that forest dwellers are harming the forest. And this is a common perception in the administration, in the judiciary, and among civil society as well to a very large extent. The next slide, please. Sorry. So
canteen lagi lo. Mesla.
Could you change the slide, please? So here I am showing you just a few pictures of forest dwellers. The previous slide, please. Pictures of forest dwellers who are asserting their control and their right over the forests. On the left hand side you see what is known as a Pathal Gadi. It's a stone on which forest dwellers have written various provisions of the constitution and of PESA, which are recognizing their rights, giving them fundamental rights to their lands and resources. On the right hand side you see below a group of youngsters who are holding up the Constitution of India, and which has become a very integral part of the way in which they interact with the forest and with the forest administration. You will find copies of the Constitution in people's pockets when you travel into the interiors. It's very interesting. And on the upper right hand side you are seeing some women who are performing some kind of religious ritual in which they're trying this holy cloth around the trees as a promise to protect the trees. In spite of this, next slide please, Anya. In spite of these very strong provisions in the Constitution on the ground, recognizing that tribals and forest dwellers have rights and have every right to be there in the forest, there continues to be a perception that forest dwellers are destroying the forest. This is just a small cartoon which has been drawn to reflect that, the perception. And it's so lopsided because on the one hand you have the kind of developmental machine that is there, the industrial machine, which has just laid waste so much of our natural resources. On the other side you have forest dwellers with maybe a small basket of minor forest produce standing there and being accused of destroying the forest. This perception continues till today. So how did this happen? Next slide please. I want to take you into the historical perspective of how this has happened. Now, prior to the colonial government coming into India, The fact that there are forest dwellers, tribals living inside forests, they have certain rights, and their rights and duties are shared along with whoever was the current monarch at the time, was a very much an accepted fact and a way of life. But in the mid 19th century, when the colonial government decided it had to assert, through various laws and legislations, assert control over the resources in India. So along with a wide array of tenancy reforms like the Bengal settlement, etc., and bringing in the zamindari system, they also brought in legislations to take control over the forests. And the first Forest Act was enacted in 1865. It's an interesting legislation. It's a very short one, unlike the one we have today. It's maybe 4 or 5 pages. But even in that, while asserting that the colonial government has the right and the power to declare lands as government forest, it also recognized that there are people inside the forest who have rights, and their rights will be allowed to continue. But at the same time, you already see the attitude of the colonial government that we are asserting our authority over this particular resource. And in the 1885 legislation, which most closely resembles the current legislation, which is also 1927, there is this very, very clear assertion of authority. And similar to many other British colonial legislations, there was always this need to sort of on paper look like you're doing justice. So they had a system by which there would be a declaration of intention, then there would be a forest settlement officer, and there was a process by which people who had pre-existing rights in those forests could be claimed before the forest settlement officer. But the reality is that the law said if you don't make your claims within 3 months, which is the limitation period, your rights still shall stand extinguished. That means that people who did not come forward to file their claims proactively, their rights were simply vanished in law. But not just did their rights vanish, so not only were they now suddenly, after centuries of being there, suddenly found that they were illegally there, but also their continuation of forest activities, whether it was cultivation or grazing or whatever, were converted into criminal offences. So the Indian Forest Act as it stands today, which was sort of started off in 1885, is the when it started off, says that certain activities are not just illegal, but there are criminal offences. And there are very, very strong powers and authorities which have been given to the forest department officials to arrest, to seize property that they may find, to put a person in detention, to take a decision whether the person, the offence which they have been charged with will go to trial before a trial court or not, or whether they will be allowed to pay a fine and compound it. These are all functions that are supposed to be performed by a judicial officer, but they are performed by the forest department officials even till today. And even giving powers of evicting people based on whatever criminal procedure they go through. So these provisions in the law, if you look at the historical process of how this law was implemented, as and where the colonial government felt that there were valuable forests which they needed for their industrial development, their industrial machine, they declared reserve forests. Very strict controls were there in those reserve forests. Very strict criminal provisions were there with imprisonment and so on in those forests. In protected forests, there was a little bit of space provided for people to continue with their activities, but the power to convert a protected forest at any point of time into a reserve forest and take away all those rights also continue to remain with the state at any point of time. And there's a small provision in the Indian Forest Act for village forests where the communities would have rights. And interestingly, there are only 2 states where village forests were actually rules were framed. One was Uttarakhand and the other was Orissa. That's another story. Another day I'll tell you about the village forest. So although there was a sort of procedure by which forests were declared on paper, but in reality, the truth is that in vast tracts of the country, forests were declared without recognizing rights. And because nobody came forward, people didn't come forward to claim their rights stood extinguished. So over a period of 100, 150 years, people were treated as criminals in their own land. Next slide, please. Now, one would have expected that after independence in 1947 and in 1950, the constitution came into force. Immediately upon independence, you see across the country land reform took place in terms of not just the land reform, but reform of the laws relating to tenancy and agriculture across the country. So abolition of zamindari, protecting the rights of the tenants, etc. Those kind of legislations have all come into force in the late 1940s after independence and early 1950s. But that kind of reform did not happen with regard to the forest areas at all. And on the other hand, what actually happened was the opposite, where the 1952 forest policy continued to assert that the forests are actually timber resource for the state and should be protected for that purpose. The 1972 Wildlife Protection Act, which talked about declaring protected areas for conservation of wildlife, took the same approach as the Indian Forest Act of declaring national parks and wildlife sanctioning from there, giving them some small compensation if they come forward. If they don't come forward, then their presence there is a criminal offense. And then the 1980 Forest Conservation Act, of course, where there was a massive amount of centralization, not just from the ground level to the state, but from the state governments to the central government. And there is a huge architecture of state level laws running from, nationalization of, say, Tendupatta, and trade and transit of minor forest produce, and all kinds of things, where increasingly the state becomes an authority. Forest department is vested with more and more authority, and the forest dwellers become increasingly criminalized, with more and more of their activities becoming crimes. There was a beginning of a change in this attitude of the state in 1988 with the new forest policy, for the first time mentioning that there is a symbiotic relationship between forest dwellers and the forest, and that relationship needs to be protected. But that was a policy statement, and there were some circulars, etc., which were issued for regularization, rights of encroachments, but they remained basically non-starters, even though they are important for our history of the forest rights movement, but they did not really take off because the laws remained the same. So in 2002, and this is something that I wish I had a little more time to go into detail, but let me just, for the sake of brevity, say that in 2002, in the Godavarman case, the Supreme Court had passed an order in one of the applications moved by the amicus curiae on behalf of the state. And the order passed by the court was completely mutilated and misrepresented by the Central Ministry of Environment to say that the Supreme Court has directed that all encroachers in forest areas should be evicted, which was actually a lie, it turned out later on. So, when we talk about the post-truth era, the post-truth era in with regard to forest started in 2002. And as a result of this, wrong notification issued by the Ministry of Environment, brutal evictions took place across central India In many places, not only were police and police force used to evict, but they also used elephants to destroy, burn crops, houses, etc. So brutal evictions took place. According to one estimate, 300,000 forest dwellers were evicted at that time. We don't know where they went even now. So as a result of this very brutal and sudden state action, which was based on a lie, what happened was that across the country there were these little movements of tribal rights, forest rights organizations, sangathans, etc. They mobilized and came together. And then there was a lot of mobilization. A lot has been written about it. I urge you to read it. So in 2005, the first draft of the Forest Rights Bill was placed before Parliament. Interestingly, at that point of time, it only included tribals. There was a lot of debate, discussion. There was a joint parliamentary committee inside, outside Parliament, on the streets, in the media. So much discussion on every kind of provision was made, and eventually the Forest Rights Act was passed in its current form in 2006, which included not just forest dwelling scheduled tribes but also other traditional forest dwellers. Next slide, please. So I'm just showing you here a snapshot of the Forest Rights Act, and this is just the cover page of the Act. Go to the next slide, please. As a lawyer, I find that one of the most important provisions of the Forest Rights Act, the next slide, the most important provisions of the Forest Rights Act actually precedes Section 1. And I've been working with the Forest Rights Act now since 2006, even prior to that. The previous slide, please. The preamble of FRA. The preamble is one of the most important indicators of the purpose, the meaning of the Forest Rights Act. And it's really important to read this properly. I won't do that because I'll be sharing my PowerPoint with you so you can read it for yourself. But these 4 paragraphs have proved to be absolutely vital in the coming, in the last 15 years, and will continue to be so. And 2-3 things that are very important here. One is that there is an acknowledgement by Parliament that after independence, where the rights of forest dwellers ought to have been recognized but were not recognized. And the result is that the historical injustice, they use the term historical injustice, which was perpetrated on them by the colonial government, continued post-independence. And there is a need to correct that historical injustice. Immediately when you use the term historical injustice, there is a connection of the Forest Rights Act to the Fundamental Rights chapter of the Constitution, and specifically to Article 15(4) of the Constitution, which talks about substantive equality and for communities which have been historically oppressed. The second thing that's really important about this preamble is that until now there has been this perception, a stereotype, that if you want to protect the forest, if you want to protect the biodiversity and wildlife, you have to remove forest dwellers. But here there is a categorical recognition in a legislation by Parliament saying that forest dwellers and scheduled tribes are part of the forest ecosystem and are vital to sustainable development and conservation of the environment. So this statement in the preamble means that even though the Wildlife Protection Act continues to exist, the Indian Forest Act continues to exist, which in some ways say the opposite, but here we have an acknowledgement in a statute that forest dwellers are part of our, if we are to protect the environment and the forest, this forest dwellers will continue to remain part of it. The next slide, please. So I mean, some of the points that I feel are very important to look at in the Forest Rights Act is that it has emerged from a unified mobilization of forest dwellers and Adivasi organizations across India. And there was a very robust drafting process with a lot of consultation back and forth. Like I said before, the initial draft that was placed before Parliament was a completely different draft to what was eventually enacted, because the draft went through such a lot of revision with the Joint Parliamentary Committee holding consultations over several months. The other thing, of course, which I've already pointed out, is the recognition of the historical injustice. The other thing that happens with the Forest Rights Act is that because the Forest Rights Act is now saying that forest dwellers are right holders, so there is a paradigm shift from the existing forest law, wildlife law, etc., where forest dwellers are treated as criminals. So the tables are turned. Now they are right holders. They are no longer criminals. So just to draw your attention and remind you of the case that I talked about right in the beginning, about the villagers who were arrested for stopping the forest department from cutting trees, and that tension between the law which is there under the Indian Forest Act, which says they're criminals, and the Forest Rights Act, which says no, they're not criminals, they're right holders and they have a right to do this. So and of course the connection with the constitutional protections that I don't think I need to go into. These are very simple provisions. And the other very important thing about the Forest Rights Act is that it connects very in very plain terms and states that it is connected to PESA. And one of the core principles of PESA that it connects itself to is the Gram Sabha. That the Gram Sabha is at the core of decision making, and of the, if you want to protect and promote and encourage the tribal way of life, you have to recognize the role of the Gram Sabha, and not just the Gram Sabha, but the hamlet level Gram Sabha in decision making at the village level. So the Gram Sabha is put at the core, and when you read the Forest Rights Act, you will see continuous references to PESA, whether it is the definition of Gram Sabha, whether it is the manner in which the Gram Sabha will hold meetings, the kind of representation in various bodies in the decision making process and so on. So that is a very important core point. And like I said, the conservation model itself has been overturned, and forest dwellers are having been recognized as being part of the forest ecosystem. There is a link here to the UN Right to Development Declaration. It's called UNDRIP. Recognizing that as indigenous people, they have the right to decide what kind of development they want inside their forests. So just to repeat, if you could go to the next slide, please. So if you look at the structure of the Forest Rights Act, there are three main components of the legislation. So the first component of the Forest Rights Act is that there is a statement of a substantive right. And that's very important. This is a core, section 4.1 is a core provision of the Forest Rights Act, because it says that forest rights are hereby vested in the forest dwellers. And then, of course, the Forest Rights Act also goes into detailed definitions of various words and phrases that it uses, including the meaning of forest rights. So there is a list of 13 or 14 types of forest activities that are included in the definition of forest rights, from cultivation for your own livelihood purposes, to your homestead, to grazing, to fishing in water bodies, to minor forest produce, to cultural rights, and so on. And the second thing that is very important, which is there provided in the Forest Rights Act, is a mechanism for recognition of rights. Now, if you recall, I had pointed out to you that there was a mechanism, continues to be a mechanism for recognition of rights in the Indian Forest Act. It's there in the Wildlife Protection Act also, but that mechanism has not worked. It's a complete failure. So it was important here in the Forest Rights Act to have a completely different mechanism. And the mechanism here is that it is the Gram Sabha at the hamlet level which starts the process of rights recognition through a Forest Rights Committee. The Forest Rights Committee holds joint site inspections along with the representatives of the Forest Department and the Revenue Department. And then the resolutions are passed by the Gram Sabha saying yes to this one, no to that one. As the community, they sit together and review all the applications that have come and then send their recommendations to the subdivisional level, to the subdivisional level committee. Subdivisional level committee then sends its recommendations to the district level committee. Now, the subdivisional level committee and district level committee also have officers from the Forest Department, Revenue Department, and Tribal Department. But most importantly, they also have representatives from the Panchayati Raj institutions, that is, elected representatives from PRIs at the subdivisional level and the district Zilla Panchayat level are members of these bodies. So, and the decisions are taken jointly. So, and the district level committee's decision is final, but it's it's different from say a legal process where you file a claim here and then it goes in appeal and then in second appeal. It's actually a complementary process. So the function of the Gram Sabha, the DLC cannot perform. The function of the DLC, the Gram Sabha cannot perform. They complement each other. So this is an important mechanism. The third thing that is really important about the Forest Rights Act is that there is a part of the definition of forest rights is the right to protect, preserve, conserve, and manage community forest resources. Now, this is included as not only in the list of forest rights, but it's also included repeatedly again and again in different ways in the Act, in the rules, in the definitions clauses. So you have very, very clear, it's not just something that is said in the air. So there is, for instance, Section 5 of the Forest Rights Act. If you could go to the next slide, Section 5 I have extracted for you, which is important to read, and it talks about how the Gram Sabha is responsible and it has the duty and responsibility and therefore also the power to protect not just the forest but also the wildlife, the biodiversity, catchment areas, water sources, the cultural and natural heritage, and most importantly, if you see subsection D, it says that the Gram Sabha has the power to take decisions to stop any activity which will adversely affect the animals, biodiversity and forests, and to ensure that those decisions are complied with. So it's putting a lot of responsibility but also giving a lot of power to the Gram Sabhas over the community forest resources. And also, like I said before, it's not this is not just like a statement of some pious pontification is put somewhere in the middle of the statute. There are processes, it's explicated in the rules. In the rules, there is a complete set of provisions which talk about setting up CFR management committees, how are those committees to make their conservation and management plans, and so on and so forth, how they're to interact with the Forest Department. So there is a network of provisions. So if you read the Act and the rules together, this is not something that is just put in there as, cut and paste in the middle, but it's very much a very integral part of the statute. Now, why is this important? Why am I placing so much of importance on this particular provision? I haven't read any of the other provisions out to you. If you go to the next slide, I have put juxtaposed for you 3 maps of India. And now I'm sorry, I had to fit them all into a slide, so they are a bit narrower than India actually is. India isn't that slim. But if you look at the first one, it shows you the what are the parts of India where there is a concentration of mineral deposits, and this is looking at major minerals. These maps I've taken from the Census of India report. The second map will show you a juxtaposition of the mineral deposits and the forest density. So you can see that there is a correlationship. And the third map is showing you the areas where there are dense is based on the density of the tribal populations. So other than say the northeast where there is the juxtaposition is a little, correlationship is a little bit difficult to assert. But if you look at the central Indian tribal belt, definitely there is a clear correlationship between where there are tribals, there are forests, and there are mineral deposits. So the mineral wealth of our country as of today, which has not been already exploited in a very large proportion, is in tribal areas and in forest areas. So this is the reason why the law relating to the forest dwellers is so important and so vital to this country. And I'm glad that Milind pointed that out to us. If you can go to the next slide. Now, as you can imagine, right from the very start, the next slide, please, Anuya. There has been very, very intense resistance to the Forest Rights Act. In fact, many times I use the analogy of FRA being a square peg in a round hole. Previous slide, please. Now, one of the interesting things about the Forest Rights Act is that it came into force on the 31st of December 2007. Within 5 weeks, literally on the 1st of March or 2nd of February 2008, the first writ petition challenging the constitutional validity of the entire act was filed in the Supreme Court, and it was followed by several writ petitions filed across the country in different high courts challenging the constitutional validity of the FRA on a variety of grounds. Many of them were quite absurd. They continue to remain absurd. But I won't get into the legal arguments of that. But who were the people who filed these petitions? It was basically retired forest officials who were representing the forest lobby. They were a certain group of wildlife conservationists who continue to believe that fortress conservation is the only way in which you can conserve forests. They are, I'm happy to say it, a minority in this country. And very interestingly, former zamindars. So you have entrenched elites filing these cases in the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, these cases are continuing to be pending, and they have all kinds of complications over the last 14 years. The other thing that happened was that some state governments just simply refused to implement the Forest Rights Act, saying we won't implement it. Or they truncated its implementation, saying that we will not recognize the community forest rights, or we will not recognize the rights of other traditional forest dwellers, or we will not apply it to protected areas. In mining areas, we will not recognize rights, and so on and so forth. The evidence-related objections were raised by certain state governments, saying that an application by a tribal for his 2 acre or 1 acre cultivation land will be valid only if it has a satellite imagery map attached to it. So things like that were happening. A number of places we have continued to see that where local communities and have asserted their rights and refused to allow this kind of subversion of the act, they have been terrorized in many different ways. Their leaders have been put into jail. And in many cases, we also seeing, especially in the last year during the COVID lockdowns, we have seen blatant violations and blatant impunity. So while tribal communities and forest dwelling communities have been told to stay indoors, you can't move out, etc., forest department workers and officials have gone into their lands where they hold pattas and done forcible tree plantations. And if they've come forward to protest, then they have been, in some cases even beaten by police. So we've seen this happen in the lockdown, very blatant violations. Next slide, please, Anuja. So the poor implementation of the Forest Rights Act, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to rush through this. I think you can guess that it's quite poor in terms of even the statistics, which the most recent statistics released by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs relate to end of February 2021. And see the numbers, they look really huge. So you have 42 lakh claims which have been filed, out of which 20 lakh claims have been allowed, and so on and so forth. But if you look at it in terms of the potential of the Forest Rights Act, then only 3% of the CFR potential and only 12% of the IFR, that is the individual forest rights potential, has been achieved till date. And quite frankly, these numbers have been stagnating over the last 5-6 years, especially. We really don't see much movement forward. The next slide, please. Now, I want to talk to you about the fact that these, as you can imagine, the law continues to remain extremely contested inside the court and outside the court. And inside the court, for instance, there is, on the one hand, you will recall that in February 2019, the Supreme Court had passed an order saying that all the people whose rights have been rejected, they are encroachers by definition, and therefore they should be evicted. Fortunately, this order was set aside, was put on hold within 2 weeks, but it's still hanging like a Damocles sword over people's heads. On the other hand, we also have very, very positive judgments coming out, and one of the most important one is the Niyamgiri judgment, where the Supreme Court, a 3-judges bench of the Supreme Court, has held that not only do the forest dwellers have a right to be consulted before their forests are diverted for a non-forest purpose like mining, but they must participate in the decision making of what does development mean to them. And this principle, if you can just take it to the next slide, please, is based on this understanding which the Supreme Court has articulated, where they have clearly stated that forests have the best chance of survival if communities participate in their conservation and regeneration measures. And recognizing also that for generations there has been a symbiotic relationship with the entire ecosystem. Now, I've just put a small quote over here, but I've given the citation of the judgment. I would really encourage you to read this judgment. It's really beautifully written. One of the rare cases in which the Supreme Court has written something quite beautiful and wonderful to read. The next slide, please. I just have a couple more slides, and then we can open up for questions. Now, the next slide, please. Yeah. So the thing that I wanted to share with you is that there is this continuous and ongoing tussle going on between the state, corporations, mining, companies, etc. on the one hand, and forest dwellers and Adivasis on the other hand. And while there is a certain amount of it happening inside the courts, yes, surely, but a lot of it is happening outside the courts. And what I find very interesting and very dynamic, and I'm happy to be able to share it with a group of people who are social scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, is because there is a tendency when we're looking at any particular law to look at the reported judgments. And then we kind of make an assessment based on, what's in the law reports. But actually, if you look at the Forest Rights Act in general and the Niyamgiri judgment in particular, you will find that local organizations, communities, Gram Sabhas have taken ownership of this principle and have asserted it over and over again. And on the left-hand side, there is this, the various efforts that are constantly being made by various government officials, etc., to undermine the Forest Rights Act. In some cases through blatant illegalities, in some cases through interpretative illegalities. But on the other hand, you see, Gram Sabhas have taken to, citing the Niyamgiri judgment and the principles it contains in Gram Sabha resolutions, or when they are talking about, so the Niyamgiri judgment related to a forest clearance under the Forest Conservation Act. So it's a limited principle of law, but they have taken that principle of law and applied it to environmental clearances, groundwater assessments, prospecting for mining leases, denotification of protected areas. So they take this principle saying we should be consulted because we are at the center of the forests and the conservation of forests. So they take this principle and reiterate it in different fact situations. Then they take it into, criminal proceedings where they might be trying to register FIRs, of course, very rarely registered. When they make representations to, say, the NHRC or the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, and so on and so forth. They are continuously reiterating this idea. And I'm so glad that the next session is going to be on PESA, because when Milind will be speaking about PESA, I'm sure he'll be referring to how the core principle of PESA is also that Gram Sabhas have to be consulted before developmental activities take place in their area. So I'll just show you a few pictures now. If you see the next slide, this is, of course, Niyamgiri was 2013, but and many of you will probably have seen many of the pictures, but I'm showing you a photograph of the Baila Dila mines. It's a beautiful, beautiful forest area with forest dwellers. It has, it's a very important elephant habitat and elephant corridor. This entire region has been earmarked for coal mining and will probably not be this way if those forest dwellers who are there fighting for the protection of these forests somehow give up. They also have a religious and spiritual attachment to these forests because they have, as you know, tribals are so they have asserted that right also under the constitution. And the next slide, the kind of future which is being projected for forest dwellers, where they are continuously told you must allow development to happen. Is this what we are talking about for that forested area? This is a photograph from Bellary in Karnataka. But is this what we want to happen to Baila Dila and many other forested areas in this country? And the next slide is that, is this the potential future of Adivasis and forest dwellers? Is this what we want for them? Is this what they want? They should agree to. So finally, I just want to say a few words. You can go to the next slide if you like. Is that the Forest Rights Act continues to be an area of contestation continuously. But the important thing about the FRA is that it has given the Adivasi rights movement, the indigenous peoples, forest dwellers movements in this country, a very, very powerful space to stand on, in which they are articulating principles and ideas which are actually as old as time itself. So the although the Forest Rights Act is thing that has come in 2006, but it is articulating something and in a tribal way of life. To me, when I go into a tribal area and we are talking about certain provisions of the constitution, I may not have a copy of my constitution with me, or and then somebody from within the participants, maybe a tribal lawyer or somebody will just pull out a copy of the constitution and say, "You're not carrying your copy? You can buy." And it's a wonderful feeling to see how people have that attachment towards the constitution. The other thing that the Forest Rights Act does, which I think is important for me to say, and I'll just conclude with that, is that it reminds us about the chapter 4 of the Constitution, which is the directive principles of state policy. They're not part of the fundamental rights chapter, but these principles are supposed to guide our economic, social, socio-political, social justice policies. And one of the most important of them, division of economic resources, local self-governance. These are principles, devolution of power, devolution of control and authority. These are principles that are becoming lost, I feel, in today's day and age, where we are just charging towards a $5 trillion economy and not thinking about the founding fathers of our constitution and what they laid down in terms of, this FR8 serves to remind us that there is a vital importance of these principles in today's day. I am using Dr. Ambedkar's words, is that legislation a law will be infused with authority by the people, by the community that asserts this law. And if we don't assert this law, there's no law, no parliament, no judiciary which can guarantee that. So with these words of Dr. Ambedkar, I'd just like to close my presentation. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Could we take a couple of questions now?
Sure, of course.
Yeah. So there are a couple of questions which I would just try and bring 2 or 3 together in the first place. One is whether the 2002 attack on the Adivasi rights, the person is asking whether these could be politically motivated. That is one. 2, the second question is whether the Forest Department was a party in the eviction order of 2019, and if not, why it was not so. There is a comment that has come in from Sarayu, who says that the latest tragedy is the Bakswala diamond mine that is going to come up after cutting 2 lakh trees in Chhatarpur district of Madhya Pradesh. I'll take the other questions that are coming up gradually, ma'am, but if you could comment on this first, we could go to the next as the time permits.
Okay. So, see, the 2002 order of the Supreme Court, one can't say that it was politically motivated. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what I mean by politically motivated, but there was no sort of, if you're talking about, say, electoral politics kind of thing, no, that was not the situation. But what definitely did happen is that before the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is a venue where very few people from marginalized communities can actually go. It's expensive, it's far, it's incomprehensible. And so the result is that inside the court, the kind of argumentation that was happening at that time was in the hands of a very few people. So there was the MICUS, there was the Ministry of Environment and Forests, there were a few Forest Department officials, there was the Central Empowered Committee. And the perspective of the forest dwellers and the Adivasis had not been put before the court. Subsequent to that order being passed, of course, a lot of applications and petitions were filed by people's rights organizations, by tribals themselves. You will not believe this. Those applications have not come up for hearing till today. That case is still pending. 2002. We're in 2021 today. So that, I mean, you can say politically motivated if you want to that. Where the 2019 orders were passed, not only were the forest departments of all the state governments, all the union territories are party to this case. They were all present in court at that time. The Ministry of Environment and Forests was present in court at that time. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs, on the 13th of February 2019, Ministry of Tribal Affairs, remember, is not just the key nodal ministry, it is named as the nodal ministry in section 11 of the Act. The Ministry of Tribal Affairs was missing from court that day. So that is something that, and why they were missing is anybody's guess. You said, if not why, that you ask the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. I completely agree with you. The Buxwaha mine, diamond mine scenario is really, really sad. What saddens me, and I think that we need to think about this as citizens of India, is that, you know, when we say that there are certain sacrifices, this is the language that is constantly being used. You know, when in the 1980s and 90s, there were this large dams, Narmada Dam, this dam and the other dam. So there was this always this argument that, you know, some people do need to sacrifice for the betterment of the country, for the advancement of the nation. You can't make an omelette without breaking an egg. So people will have to make sacrifices, and it's sad that it's the tribals who are making the sacrifices, but sacrifices have to be made. Diamonds? What is the national interest for diamonds? You're building dams, maybe I can understand that. You're building hydel projects, maybe. Mining, maybe. But diamonds? I absolutely don't know. And let me tell you, there are egregious violations of the law. Not exact. Environmental laws have been violated, mining laws have been violated, land alienation laws have been violated, all kinds of violations. So if you were to list the violations of law, not only should the Buxwaha project be stopped, but the people who are in charge of that project should probably be prosecuted and put in jail.
May I take one more?
Sure.
There's a question which says that Adivasis, considering their low numbers in the population, don't really constitute a major voting bloc. So their rights are further taken lightly, making them dependent only on NGOs to fight for their rights majorly. Can there be can there be any other legal provisions that can be safely implemented that would protect Adivasis, less relying on arbitrary machinery of the state?
Actually, that question is a very wonderful segue into the next session. So whoever has asked this question, I would urge you to actually stay back for the next session, which Milind is going to be talking about, which is the implementation of not just the Panchayats Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, but the entire principle of decentralized governance in a real and meaningful way. So, you know, part 9 and 10 of the Constitution was brought in 1992, I think. But in which part of the country have the panchayats and the gram sabhas actually come into themselves as, you know, the fourth tier of representative democracy? It has not happened. And if you're looking for an answer, I don't think we can find that answer in, you know, more reservations for tribal MPs or more reservations for tribal MLAs, or, you know, of course, it would be good if that happened. But say, for instance, the tribes advisory councils, which are there in the states, especially the scheduled area states, the tribe advisory councils are not doing their job. It would be good if they were to do their job, meet regularly, think about what's going on in their states. The governors of the states where there are scheduled areas, they have a lot of roles and responsibilities, but I think other than Maharashtra, none of the other governors actually even think about what is it that they can do in the scheduled areas. So all these things are of course there, but I don't think that any of these will be like the magic bullet kind of solution. The only thing that will work is active participation at the Gram Sabha level of the people. Can I just take a minute to give an example?
Sure, ma'am.
Yeah. So, and this is an example from Maharashtra itself. I know many of you are from Maharashtra, but during the first lockdown last year, when we had this massive efflux of migrant workers going back to their villages and complete chaos in terms of, how are the villages now going to provide for them. We heard so many stories from villages and gram sabhas who have been implementing the Forest Rights Act, who have been taking the sales of their minor forest produce and putting them into bank accounts, managing that money properly. They actually had reserves which they used to provide food and other facilities to the migrant workers coming back into the village. And you will find this not just in Maharashtra but even in states like Orissa, Chhattisgarh, even Jharkhand. Wherever the Gram Sabhas had a little bit of financial liquidity, because they have been asserting their rights under the Forest Rights Act, they have been accessing their minor forest produce, and their standard of living has gone up a little bit. They're not living on the margins of deprivation and starvation. They were able to help each other. And if you're looking at, something like really implementing, say, the Atmanirbhar Bharat model, then we have to be looking at how to make the Gram Sabha stronger, more self-reliant, and better equipped to deal with disasters. And that it's a beautiful example from Maharashtra of the way the Gram has pulled together to help and ensure that the migrant workers didn't die of starvation.
I'm just sneaking in one last question, ma'am. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit more time. The question says that it is regarding the migrating community, such as the Agariyas, the salt farmers in Gujarat, DNT, who do not fall under forest dwellers but stay in the wild as sanctuary for 8 months for salt production. So, how can such a community be justified under FRA?
See, this is a very, it's a really heartbreaking question. As a lawyer, I don't have any answer to this question, because the Forest Rights Act, even though it tries its level best to be as inclusive as possible, it includes non-tribals who are forest dwellers and so on and so forth. But there are limitations to this statute. It applies only to forest lands, and it applies only to forest dwellers. So even scheduled tribes who are not forest dwellers cannot claim any eligibility under this act. So when it comes to DNTs, and this is a problem which is not happening only to the Agariya community in Gujarat, but across the country, wherever there are DNT tribes, say for instance the Pardis in Madhya Pradesh, or pastoral communities in certain parts of say Uttarakhand, the Gujar community is not recognized as a scheduled tribe, and although they are recognized as a scheduled tribe in Himachal. All these communities, because of the inconsistencies in classification of these communities as scheduled tribes, the benefits of the Forest Rights Act are not reaching them. This is a problem, and this problem does need to be solved. This is the kind of thing that the Ministry of Tribal Affairs needs to be doing on a war footing. Having said that, I do recall that a few years ago there was a very interesting decision of the Andhra Pradesh High Court. If you recall, during the Salva Judam days, there was a lot of migration of tribal communities from Chhattisgarh into the forest areas of Andhra Pradesh, the adjoining forest areas, and they are not recognized as scheduled tribes in Andhra Pradesh. So when they started filing their claims under the Forest Rights Act, the Andhra Pradesh government said, you are not OTFDs, you haven't been here for 75 years, you're not scheduled tribes because you're not recognized as scheduled tribes, you can't get rights. So the High Court said that since this is a beneficial legislation, we should interpret it widely and in its correct spirit. So if there is a case that can be made out that in a particular area, this particular community, for the purposes of the Forest Rights Act, nothing else. We're not asking for reservations in jobs. We're not asking for school admissions. We're not asking for scholarships, etc., etc. just for the purposes of the Forest Rights Act, because it's a beneficial legislation, please treat these people as scheduled tribes. I think that case can be made out and it needs to be asserted. But again, it's a difficult, it's a very difficult argument to make. Technically, it's difficult.
Thank you so much, ma'am.